organizing and Amir for putting the Zoom part together. It is common knowledge among readers of the Hebrew Scriptures that the Bible presents two versions of the idea of God's kingship. The God is the only king model, and the king is not God model. According to the God is the only king model, kingship is an exclusive attribute of God. By contrast, in the king is not God model, God shares his political power with human beings. While both are present in the biblical text, the history of the Jewish political tradition attests to the dominance of the latter over the former. Certainly, both models presuppose the theopolitical primacy of God over human political agents. However, according to the Sinai Covenant, the Jewish people are a body politic, and Judaism is a this-worldly tradition that recognizes a difference between legitimate and illegitimate expressions of political authority. This is why Jewish history is the history of the community and its relationship to, and legal and philosophical reflection upon, a range of political players, including but not limited to kings, priests, prophets, rabbis, non-Jewish kings, and sovereign states. Despite this long history, it's noteworthy that throughout his career, Martin Buber worked to restore the critical significance of the king as the only, of God as the only king model. In The Kingship of God, Buber asserts, quote, "There is no political sphere outside the theopolitical," unquote. Indeed, one might argue that Buber's theopolitics is stricter and more modern than the biblical account of the God is the only king model found in Judges, which actually leaves open the possibility of a king who does not claim to act as a redeemer, while Buber's theopolitics rules out the legitimacy of all human political agents. In what follows, I will suggest that Buber's theopolitics assumes the shape of the modern image of the beautiful soul, a symbolic metaphor widely deployed by modern novelists and philosophers alike, and used to describe both religious believers and women. The beautiful soul image generates a host of problems for those to whom it is applied. In response, feminist scholars have developed rigorous analyses of the image's negative political implications for women. Below, I will show how these feminist challenges can illuminate key problems with Buber's theopolitics and offer grounds to justify a reconciliation between Buber's critical theopolitics and the king is not God model that's developed throughout the Jewish political tradition. Among the central themes of Buber's Kingship of God and his essay, The Holy Way, is the notion that there is an oppositional relationship between the human will and the divine will, and that only the latter grounds the hope for real human community. Sounding almost soteriological in orientation, Buber maintains a not only privileged but essential place for God's agency as the primary determinant of a non-tragic historical outcome. Only God can authorize and ultimately realize true communal or political life. Left to themselves, human beings seek to, quote, politicize history to make it an arena of merely political interest or illegitimate power, unquote. There is no legitimate form of autonomous human political activity, since non-theologically grounded human activity amounts to little more than the, quote, vain, bewildering, and seditious desire of men to rule over men, unquote. No doubt, Buber's work is replete with references to judges, prophets, and community members who share in the labor of realizing God's will. Buber is as resistant to Gnostic dismissals of this world as he is to apocalyptic narratives of history. Nonetheless, the human capacity to participate in the work of the realization of the true community is predicated upon its reception of God's charis or grace. The true community, he says, quote, is the relationship in which the divine comes to its realization between man and man, unquote. As such, the charismatic leader is nothing more than, quote, the figure temporarily inhabited by the charis of divine spirit, unquote. Indeed, throughout his career, Buber identified the prophet or the Navi as the agent of theopolitical work. In an essay entitled Symbolic and Sacramental Existence, Buber describes the prophet as, quote, the real existence of a human person that can itself be sacrament, unquote. The mediator between the divine and the human, the prophet performs a critical role in the, quote, real sacred drama of God's intervention into the world of human history and human need, but is not a human political actor. The prophet is not a human political actor. As the agent of God's word, her actions are not her own. Moreover, driven by her immediate conviction concerning God's word and its self-evidence, the Navi is unwilling to explain or legitimize this conviction to others, since this would compromise the prophet's unconditional commitment to God's will. Thus, the Navi resists the world and its public reactions, since she knows that her actual deed, quote, is dragged into the mud as soon as it enters the world and becomes visible. Buber's description of the Navi is strikingly similar to the modern image of the beautiful soul. The notion of the beautiful soul emerges in the 18th century and appears in the work of many writers, including Goethe, Schiller, and most famously Hegel. In both his early theological writings and in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes the beautiful soul as a figure whose moral heart, quote, has no need for the vaulted knowledge of men, a figure much like Jesus, who can find no moral home with his people, unquote. Both Hegel's beautiful soul and Buber's Navi see themselves as bearers of a divine moral spirit that seeks to shape loving communities, but resists human communication, judgment, and deliberation. However, unlike Buber, Hegel recognizes the beautiful soul's fateful internal contradiction. Driven by its moral convictions, its refusal to subject these convictions to the reflection of others denies it the very conditions it needs to exist. As Hegel explains, the beautiful soul, quote, lives in dread of besmirching the splendor of its inner being by action or existence, and persists in self-willed impotence. That's from the Phenomenology. Moreover, in this willingness to forego self-preservation, the beautiful soul licenses the suspension of moral actuality and instantiates the opposition between a public sphere unmoved by moral consciousness and a moral consciousness unwilling to alter it. When applied to Buber's Theopolitics, it becomes clear that the prophet's refusal to subject his convictions to the reflections of the public inadvertently emboldens the very political arena the prophet means to challenge. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, the beautiful soul constitutes a single chapter in the history of modern intellectual consciousness, and, like the other stages before and after it, it serves as an instantiation of reason's drive to preserve itself. Thus, in Hegel's account, the beautiful soul must and does seek its own rational actualization, and its apparent reticence to do so registers as hypocrisy. However, the moral spirit secures its existence through the rational communal determination of its convictions as these convictions become candidates for universal truths that may develop through this process over the course of time. Stated otherwise, Hegel's account offers an upbeat story of the eventual deprivatization of the beautiful soul. The rational community that supersedes it has no investment in the preservation of the beautiful soul and its will to non-existence, since the community is itself made up of moral subjects who, as lapsed beautiful souls, now seek public recognition and secure their existence through it. Unfortunately, Hegel's promising account of the deprivatization of the beautiful soul overlooks the possibility of a community that does sustain interest in the privatization of the beautiful soul. Rational constructions of the universal often compete with ideological constructions of a faux universal, when by the latter I mean determinations of the so-called universal by a select group of individuals who purposely exclude particular voices from this process of determination. In other words, modern liberalism not only introduces the idea of a rational community that integrates the private convictions of the beautiful soul into the deliberations of a rational community, it also introduces the possibility of a community that preserves the exclusion of the beautiful soul and its moral force from the public realm, which it identifies with the universal laws of market and state. Within modern liberal structures, both religion and women have played the role of the beautiful soul, privatized and imprisoned by their non-actualization in the public sphere. While it has taken religious thinkers a long time to recognize the negative outcomes of this privatization, feminist political theorists have developed rigorous analyses of these negative outcomes, analyses that can eliminate the deficits of Buber's theopolitical embrace of the beautiful soul. More specifically, qua its aversion to public action, the beautiful soul inadvertently acts as an endorsement of morally unregulated public decisions and deeds. Feminist political scholarship expands this analysis and illuminates how, when applied to women in the modern context, the beautiful soul is used as both a justification for political power and a means by which those relegated to the private sphere, i.e. women and children, are subordinated to that power. For example, in an article entitled "Women in the Public Sphere, A Modern Perspective," political historian Joan Landis demonstrates how the image of the beautiful soul is exploited through the modern Western political division between the public and private realms and its set of attending oppositions. If, as Landis concedes, modern political discourse distinguishes itself from its pre-modern predecessors in its support for the rights of the modern subject, it is also true that modern political discourse retains pre-modern patriarchal attitudes which, quote, denied women's status as a political subject and identified women as beautiful souls best suited for the private realm. As Landis explains, quote, the discursive field of modern political theorizing was constituted by a binary structure of oppositions between public and private, state and family, discourse and silence, universal and particular, culture and nature, rational and irrational, that indicated the uneasy relationship of women to politics, unquote. Thus, the identification of women as beautiful souls supported the perpetuation of pre-modern patriarchal power in a modern context and guaranteed the ongoing subordination of women to it, and even for Landis restricted the goals of early modern feminist political movements. In her scholarship, Jean Elshton examines how the beautiful soul narrative is appropriated by national war discourse and used to justify military violence and patriarchal power. According to Elshton, the identification of women as beautiful souls offers a permission slip for men to act as the ugly beasts who fight on behalf of the beautiful souls who cannot act and need protection. Thus, if women represent the moral souls whose job it is to care for their children and preserve the moral heart and soul of society, men are positioned to be the, quote, just warriors or the heroes who protect their innocent women and children from the evils of the enemy. War, according to Elshton, is therefore necessary and hereby justified because the world would be unthinkable without innocent women, unquote. Finally, in her book, The Sexual Contract, political theorist Carol Pateman reinforces the feminist critique of the beautiful soul. According to Pateman, the beautiful soul not only supports patriarchal power and subordinates women, it serves as an oppressive presupposition of the modern social contract, which secures the fraternity and liberty of its members, but which takes for granted the accompanying sexual contract or idea that women, qua women, are subordinate to men. Not only does the sexual contract permit the social contract to preserve patriarchal power in a modern context, it permits the social contract to hide this patriarchal orientation behind the veil of the notion of members' tacit consent. As a primarily fraternal set of bonds, the social contract installs a double standard whereby women qua women are associated with the private sphere, so that even when they do participate in the social contract, they do so from a subordinate position. Thus, as Pateman explains, the rights of women are not the same as the rights of the citizen. Taken together, these feminist criticisms of the beautiful soul and its retention by modern political structures challenge Buber's accommodation of the Navi to this modern image. As noted earlier, women are not the only figures associated with the beautiful soul. Modern writers and thinkers have also mapped the image onto religious believers, characterizing them as moral, pious, and yet set apart from the corrupting forces of the profane order. Thus here too, the beautiful soul serves as a justification for immoral political tendencies and a guarantee of the subordination of religion to state power. One sees this model even in thinkers as liberal as Moses Mendelssohn, for whom religion, qua its place in the non-political private sphere, is designed to provide moral justification for adherence to state power, the same state power that secures religion's political subordination. Thus, in his or her role as the silent saint, Buber's prophet also perpetuates the dominance of a state power unfettered by the politically powerless voices of those who attempt to advance moral objections to it. Even so, in my concluding section, I want to argue that a feminist analysis of Buber's beautiful soul does not stop here. In her essay, Love and State, the late 20th century British philosopher Gillian Rose, who Vivian spoke about so eloquently yesterday, tackles Carol Pateman's analysis of the sexual contract in a way that has significant implications for Buber's Theopolitics. In this essay, Rose concurs with Pateman and other feminists in their concern over the subordination and exploitation of women in the private sphere. Nonetheless, from Rose's perspective, and this is the difficulty of Gillian Rose's thought, but here it is. From Rose's perspective, but I think the accuracy of Rose's thought. From Rose's perspective, Pateman's critical analysis does not go far enough, because she takes for granted the absolute opposition between the private and the public, when in fact this fixed determination reflects an ideological distortion of the historical and conceptual relationship between the two spheres. Pateman and other feminists, quote, misunderstand that the distinctions between private and public are themselves posited by the legality of the modern state, and that the modern state has a history that can be reconstructed, unquote. According to Rose, a closer examination of the notion of the modern legal state reveals a complicated and non-strictly oppositional relationship between morality and law, the individual and the universal, and the so-called private and public spheres. Modernity itself is shaped by the tension, but the ongoing relationship between the two sides of the Enlightenment: moral freedom or Geist on the one hand, and objective mathematical and scientific law on the other hand. Thus, in Rose's estimation, there is a perpetual tendency for each to challenge the rightful place of the other, i.e., law can consume moral freedom, and moral freedom can call law into question. This, in turn, promotes the development of ideological visions, like those presented by the modern legal state, that strive to subordinate one to the other, in this case, moral freedom to so-called objective law. Fortunately, as Rose maintains, ideological distortions can be challenged through genealogical analyses that expose the falsity of the oppositional structures they present as absolute. In the case at hand, Rose explains that a proper genealogy of the modern legal state exposes the false fixity of the opposition between morality and law, or between private and public, and it unveils the interdependence and vulnerability of the two sides to each other. Moreover, this genealogical critique of ideology opens up new dimensions of the power relationship, this is her key point, between the two conceptually related sides of the modern legal state. From such a perspective, the public-private relation mirrors Hegel's master-slave relation, whereby the master's power is compromised by her need for the slave, that is to say, objective law, and the state is compromised by its actual need for the beautiful soul. And the slave's power is, despite its increased power now vis-a-vis the state, the slave's power is nonetheless dependent upon her importance to the master. Not simply a sphere of powerlessness and victimhood, the private sphere of the beautiful soul operates as an object of the fear and anxiety of those whose power can be challenged by it. But inversely, the power sustained by moral subjectivity does stand in relation to the power or significance of law and its tendency to disregard human interests and assert unregulated expressions of power. In the modern context, neither can avoid the reality of its conceptual pair. Admittedly, Rose's critique of Pateman's position may seem overly accommodationist. However, it not only shows how Pateman's critique of the beautiful soul endorses the very ideology it seeks to challenge, since it takes for granted its fixed oppositions. It also shows how feminists like Pateman wax utopian in their hope to get rid of the system altogether, when by utopian I mean lacking an awareness of the historical context within which their own thought participates. More significantly, Rose's analysis opens the door to the politicization of the beautiful soul, since it awakens to its political value. On the one hand, it allows the beautiful soul to understand why ideological state forces work to silence its impulse to moral critique, and it emboldens the beautiful soul to illuminate and restore modernity's appreciation for the value of moral subjectivity and freedom. On the other hand, it does alert the beautiful soul to its inevitable participation in the worldly sphere, its laws, its institutions, and its interest in power. In an essay entitled Kierkegaard and Buber Reply to the Single One, Rose applies this very same critique she issues against Pateman's feminist account of the beautiful soul to Buber's own Theopolitics. Here she says that, quote, in spite of adopting Landauer's injunction to examine social contradictions, Buber fails to understand the relation between the violence of the state as such, the political structure and history of the modern state, the promise of universal human rights, and the particular national sovereignties necessary to guarantee them or abuse them, unquote. Moreover, Rose says, quote, Buber dismisses any intermediary or mediation between God and man because it would imply a share in power and domination. As a result of such nihilism, the inner life is left at the mercy of a repeated terror, while the outer world is affirmed in its repeated violence. However, this is my last point, Rose's analysis can also, but she doesn't offer this analysis, Rose's analysis, I think, can also redeem the critical dimension of Buber's Theopolitics. And Claire had earlier said that she hoped to also redeem the critical capacity of Buber's Theopolitics. I think that Rose's analysis can redeem the critical dimension of Buber's Theopolitics by politicizing it and relating it to the public realm, by establishing that there is an inevitable relationship between the beautiful soul and its world. Rose's analysis demonstrates how Buber's prophet participates in the historical and political conditions of her time. Like the beautiful soul, the Navi learns that she simply cannot avoid having a seat at the modern political table. Her convictions simply do impact the modern public sphere, and she must consequently subject them to communal review. As well as politicized, she is inevitably implicated in the realities of the public sphere, its laws and presumptions of power. She must accept the sober reality that sometimes her critical posture and self-critique will adequately guard against her acquiescence to these forms of power, and sometimes it will not. This is the price any theopolitical critique that strives to make a difference in the world must pay. In other words, Rose's analysis reminds Buber to recognize the necessary relation between the two versions of biblical theopolitics. No doubt, from a Rosian perspective, there is no the king is not God model without the theopolitical recognition of God's authority. But there is no political theopolitics that refuses to take its place in the realities of history and its changing political structures, lest it vanish like the beautiful soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randi. And we'll open the